this week I decided to go into something that, if you saw my video for the new Bill Condon's Beauty and the Beast that came out earlier this year, you basically saw me figure out in real time that Edward Scissorhands and Beauty and the Beast are kind of the same movie. Because you have, the dude whose appearance is very off-putting and scary to people, who lives up in the castle by himself, who eventually is united in one way or another with this beauty that's human, and she's put off by him at first, but then ultimately learns to love him, and then at some point they end up back in the castle where her boyfriend, or would-be boyfriend, is trying to kill him, and we know how that turns out. The obviously romantic relationships themselves have different endings, sadly. One of them is much more tragic than the other, but for the most part, yeah. It's like if I had a choice, I'd probably talk about Jean Hart's Beauty and the Beast from 1946, the French version, but as far as comparing the two, it's always weird to me. I did this with Shrek and The Princess Bride. It is a little weird to compare an animated movie to a live-action one, but you'd be surprised how much they tend to have in common when you really take a look at them. So that's what we're going to do, and we're going to start with Edward Scissorhands, I think, because it's going to be another one of those reviews that's a bit one-sided, much as I, love both of them. The thing that really starts off Edward Scissorhands is this, really it's the same thing with Beauty and the Beast as well, this kind of storybook framing device where it's kind of told to us like it's this old tale or something out of a storybook or whatever, that is much like, say, The Princess Bride is being told to a child by an older person. In Edward Scissorhands, not so much Beauty and the Beast, but and we immediately have this kind of... It is obviously a Tim Burton movie. This was right between Batman movies. Yeah. I had to stop and think for a second. It was 2 years after Beetlejuice. And then there was... It just kind of has this whole thing. Tim Burton kind of has a much lesser reputation than he used to, but this movie, when you look back at it and Beetlejuice and all them, you realize there is a reason that he was at the status he was at, and it always kind of breaks my heart a little bit when people just kind of automatically say Tim Burton is shit now, just in general, and it's almost like you kind of tend to forget that he used to make these masterpiece movies, or movie in this case, where... And he always has this very attention to detail. Like, the whole story itself came about this story he came up with when he was a kid, when he was like 11 or something. And then you go forward and you see all these different details. There's when old Winona is telling the story to this child. This child is like, it looks like a very tiny person amidst this gigantic bed. And then we go forward and we go out and up and we get our first shot of the castle, and it reminds us of that opening Beetlejuice shot where it goes over the model, only it's all snowy now, and supposedly what we're actually looking at. And then we immediately cut back and we're in the story now, and we're in this Blue Velvet style neighborhood where it's obviously everything. Like in Beetlejuice, we realize that we're starting off with a model, and then we're end up seeing an actual town. In this particular case, we know we're looking at an actual town, but it almost just looks like a model. And it just looks really almost Wes Anderson-like in its brightness and cheerfulness and meticulousness, but then... And then how everything is just kind of so close-knit, even though it's... The surface of it is the fact that almost all of these people have, like, terrible personalities and are just, like, gossip queens. We have the shots where all the guys... It's very 1950s. All the dudes go to work at the exact same time, and the women just kind of stay at home and keep all the lines busy, where they're even... To the point that when they try to call each other, the lines are busy because everybody else is gossiping about something. There's little details, like when... the bank in this town is literally just a white building with the word bank on it in small letters. And that's all it is. It's almost like a child set up the town, kind of like Tim Burton's 11-year-old mind at the time. And then we go forward and we meet Diane Weist's character, who is going around and kind of giving us... We get the feel of the characters as she goes door to door, which is an interesting way to do that, to kind of introduce the characters. And then for some reason, she gets the idea that it would be a good idea to go all the way up the hill into the really creepy looking castle that's at the end of this it's obviously very much a contrast to this. It's something that would only exist in a storybook-like setting. This mountain with this castle at the top of it amidst this neighborhood. But she goes ahead and goes up there because that's her personality, and she's like, maybe there's somebody up there that wants Avon shit. And it's really interesting the way they introduce the castle itself and this whole thing where when you see it from the distance, obviously it's very, very sinister looking. Like the only thing we don't see is a streak of lightning behind it. And then when she goes up there, it's kind of a sinister way to get up there, but then once she's up there, it looks so enchanting with all the bushes and all how he's done the thing that he will do later where he's trim the bushes into shapes and all that. If you've read the Shining book, maybe it's not looking so friendly, but for the most part, it just looks nice and enchanting and almost like this utopia of sorts. And then she goes inside and it's right back to being sinister again. And we just kind of get this back and forth throughout the whole thing, and then that back and forth happens one more time when we get... For starters, I like the way he's not shrouded in mystery for very long, because he's introduced pretty early, but they keep him shrouded in mystery just enough when I really like the moment when she's kind of at the steps, and it's my understanding that little statue there was like kind of like an early prototype for the Boogeyman from The Nightmare Before Christmas, apparently. But while she's standing there, we don't even really realize that there is a shadow on the wall until it moves. And it just kind of gives him this vibe of him kind of lurking in the shadows. We also got that shot over his shoulder right before we cut to the flashback. And once she finally goes up there and meets him, we realize this character could have been totally and completely terrifying. This moment when Elfman's score really builds and she sees him crouched in the corner, and we just see like the dark figure of him coming forward, and we see what his shape is, and if you don't know, it's terrifying. But what I really love, and this is when depth starts to come into play, is how it goes from this, like we were talking about with, it looks really sinister, then looks enchanting, just back and forth at a moment's notice. In just one instant, Edward goes from this totally terrifying figure in the dark to the innocent character we know him to be. Just when he steps into... Because when he steps into the light, obviously it's still jarring if you don't know what he looks like ahead of time. But what Depp does here is the voice. We see him, and yeah, we're kind of off-put by his appearance, but when we hear his voice when he says, "Don't go," that innocence in him immediately sets in, and it takes the fear out of it immediately, and that's where we kind of are immediately thrown into how we're going to feel about this character for most of the movie, just with one line delivery from Depp that changes everything we feel about this in an instant, even though we've just been introduced to the whole picture here. And I think that's a very good starting point for how we go on, and makes it more... Obviously, it's not a movie that has to be believable, because it feels like this fairy tale. So most of the things in the movie that are really outlandish, you just automatically accept. But there is kind of that kind of ground there where it kind of feels like this is kind of how people would react, and it kind of makes it to where you actually do buy that he has enough of a presence about him that he's not just immediately... Like, they don't immediately call the police when they see him. They will eventually, but when they first see him, it's all just more curiosity than anything else. And then, obviously, you know, being the Gossip Queen's, curiosity is just their nature, but... yeah, just kind of in this more or less real way. But then, before going into anything else, there's something that absolutely needs to be talked about, and that is Danny Elfman's contribution to this movie. Obviously, he's been working with Burton forever, and he's obviously branched off into stuff like, a whole shitload of stuff, but off the top of my head, there's like Gus Van Sant's To Die For, or Raimi's, Oz movie, and so many different things there. Even movies that aren't even remotely in this area. I think he did like Good Will Hunting score, stuff like that. But he's mostly known for his Burton scores, and they have that very recognizable quality to them. But the thing here is, Beetlejuice is a masterpiece of a score. I really love his score for Batman Returns. With all that said, and with all the body of work he has, I don't think he has ever topped his work here. I think Ice Dance alone is just about some of the best movie composition you will ever hear. And it just really, really brings this movie to life and gives it that whole fairy tale like feel. But not just that aspect, but also the romantic aspects later too. It's really just it's easily one of the best movie scores of all time, I think. And now that that's been addressed, another part of this you can go into is we talk about the kind of sinister thing and the whole, at first Edward could have been terrifying. It's only when we get back and we see the contrast where he's kind of like a fish out of water in this scenario that we realize that a lot of this movie is a comedy. And we don't realize at first, like, we've seen the Tim Burton world and we know Beetlejuice, obviously, was this hilarious comedy. Pee-wee's Big Adventures, this hilarious comedy. But with this movie, you kind of have, with all that other feel to it, and the fact that it does get very dark and very sad by the end, it's still a comedy for a good portion of the movie. Watching him try to interact with these people, even though he's a very tragic character. And sometimes it could be, obviously he has accidents throughout it where he accidentally cuts himself, or he doesn't realize when windows are there. And then eventually it kind of takes on this silent approach where there's just that scene where sound just kind of disappears for a while. The only thing we really hear is the sound of his hands as he's trying to put clothes on or observe himself in a mirror. But then there's stuff like, there's a lot of deadpan humor and a lot of deadpan delivery too, especially from the side characters. Like, one that really stands out is the guy, after his court hearing, when the guy's saying all the different stuff where it's like, he's had such little communication with the outside world. It's just the way he functions is going to be... And he just goes into this whole thing about how Edward can't function in society. And the cop asks, so is he going to be alright? And the guy just says, oh yeah, and just walks away. There's a lot of deliveries like that. Also playing up on the kind of silent aspect is I love the moments between him and Arkin, especially the first dinner table scene when Edward's trying to pick up a pea, and Arkin's like internally cheering for him. And when he drops it, Arkin just has that disappointed look on his face. Like, he's disappointed for him that he couldn't do it. Just little interactions like that, I think, really give the movie this life when nobody's speaking and we're just watching things happen in silence. It really plays up those scenes to its advantage. And then there's just little moments where we just realize that he doesn't communicate the way that we do, and there's gonna be all those misunderstandings. A mild one would be when Arkin keeps calling him Ed, and then when Diane Weiss corrects him and says Edward, he thinks he's being addressed. And so they really play with that, but I also really like how they use those little moments where he's obvious, like where his scissors come into play, where they don't function well in this world, like with the waterbed. This very funny moment where he accidentally pokes a hole in it, and then does it many times when Kim scares him. But the way they seamlessly transition this harmless comedy of, oh no, look what his scissors can do, turns into the danger that they are to where when accidents happen with these, they're not always going to be funny. And there's a seamless transition from that where we can laugh and there can be silly scenes, but then they can do the same thing, but when it's a person, we realize it's a bigger thing. And so I thought that was handled really well. And it's like it's another one of those movies where if he really didn't have a grasp on it, the tone in this movie would have been all over the place. But it's handled so perfectly that they're able to kind of transition back and forth, and all the scenes work, and there's never kind of a moment where the line bleeds and you're not quite sure what's supposed to be funny and what's supposed to be serious. It's always very apparent when you're supposed to laugh and when you're supposed to realize, oh, this is a big deal. This is serious. And another thing that really makes this movie work, obviously, is we were talking about the characters, especially the side characters. Obviously, one of the big standouts in this movie, I think, is Diane Waste, where what I really, I think is very interesting about Peg's character is we talked about the neighborhood and how the neighborhood looks very perfect and almost like a model, and how it's almost like we're in some 50s sitcom or something. And the weird thing is that Peg fits this world so much because she's just kind of so obliviously bubbly, and just seems to be so happy about everything, more or less. I mean, she has those real qualities. Like, by the time, she's reached the end of her day at the beginning of the movie, before she goes up to the castle, she's sick of everyone's shit. But she still does her best to be bubbly and happy and all that. So she's a really good fit for the world we're looking at on the surface. But the weird thing about that is that she's the outcast. Because she's so happy all the time, because everybody else are just these kind of vile personalities, and very kind of unlikable characters, with just these, that have like these horrible things under the surface. And I also like the way that plays into her relationship with Edward too, where it's very this kind of very motherly quality, where she's just as protective of him as she would be her own children. And just that relationship they have when they're doing certain activities together. One very touching moment in the movie, obviously, is after Kathy Baker has convinced him that he should start cutting people's hair, and after he's done the whole neighborhood, Peg is the last one, and there's that one little moment where he dusts the chair off for her. It's a really nice moment, and it just shows off their relationship really well. And then obviously another big character in this story would be Winona, and we realize that she's going to be the beauty to his beast at some point. And I love the way they first introduce that, because obviously the first time she's off camping with Jim and their weird buddies, so the first time he sees Kim, it's just a picture. And I really like the way this scene is shot, where I could be overthinking this, like it could just be the way the scene happened, but the way, when he sees her picture, the way the camera pans on the shelf, because they're looking at all the different pictures, when it pans over to her, and the shelf is like casting a shadow, so it looks like this almost like dreamlike thing, where everything else in the background is kind of out of the picture, and the sole focus is on her picture, and it's like that's the way he's seeing it. So I really, almost kind of like when you have a memory of somebody, like, even if it could be a place or a person or whatever, where you see a particular beauty and the memory can exaggerate it. It kind of feels like we're looking at somebody's exaggerated memory of who they find to be a beautiful person, the way we see her picture for the first time, and it's like the rest of the background is gone. So, like I said, I could be overthinking that shot, but that's kind of the way I've always seen it, the way that shadow kind of casts over it. And she just has that very angelic way about her, and it's also a very interesting transition when you think about the way she's so bright and angelic in this, with like the red hair and the white dresses, and you think back to just 2 years ago in Beetlejuice when she was the complete and total opposite, but she's able to make both work perfectly. Still to this day, a very, very underrated actress, despite having a couple of Oscar nominations. Still, I still feel like she never quite got the credit, despite her popularity in the late 80s and early 90s, for just how much she can really bring to a character and bring them to life and make you kind of see all the facets of them without hardly any dialogue. So I felt like she really brought that to life well. But then there's other cases like Vincent Price, who is a just wonderful addition to this movie. When he's another one of those cases where he's the perfect casting choice for starters, because he does that very almost grandfatherly like way where when we're kind of getting the story from old Winona's perspective, there's something very similar when we see Vincent Price's character talking to Edward, or even the way Peg treats Edward. And he just has that very pleasant, joyful way about him, and to where we totally buy this is the kind of guy that it would, create a life such as Edward when we come to learn the way Edward is. But the thing about the casting of Vincent Price is obviously, back in the day, he had a lot of sinister roles. There's a few movies out there where he's the hero, but for the most part, he seems to be known for his very sinister roles. For my money, you need to see Theater of Blood and The Abominable Dr. Phibes if you haven't. Those movies are fucking crazy in the best possible way, and he is just these horrific but awesome, and it's just great to watch him in those roles where he just really eats up those villain roles. And here, when Vincent Price first walks on the screen, we've seen the castle looking really sinister. We know this dude is in this place by himself, so we're not quite sure what to expect from him when we get this, and it ends up being that when he walks out, it's kind of like Edward, where at first you think the dude behind all this must be really scary and sinister or whatever, and then he comes out and just immediately you get this vibe of, oh, it's not that at all. And so I thought that was done really well. His death scene also is incredibly tragic and really kind of sets the mood for the direction the ending ends up going. It's definitely one of the more memorable scenes of the movie and one of the more heartbreaking. One more casting choice I'd like to talk about here, obviously, is Anthony Michael Hall going against type. Because, and this kind of seemed to be his transition from, when you look at, I was just watching a movie the other day with him, Dead in Tombstone with Danny Trejo, where he was like the villain in this supernatural western, and it was like, it's so weird what he has come to when he started off as the geek in 16 Candles and The Breakfast Club and Weird Science and all that. And it seems like this was kind of his transition to that person we don't even recognize anymore as that kid, where you could still kind of tell it was him. His appearance was changing, but you could still kind of tell it was him. But the way he was taking on this role, Jim is the kind of guy that would just have beaten the absolute shit out of his characters from the John Hughes movies. And it had to have been so weird and jarring to see him in this role, and when you first hear it, you probably think, what even the hell? Like, what, like, what would Burton be thinking to cast him in that role? But you watch it, and he actually is totally convincing as this dude that can go from just the jock type to a dude that's ultimately dangerous, especially when he's under the influence of alcohol, and this dude that is just this total and complete asshole that can transition from one extreme to a totally different extreme. And it was kind of crazy how he was able to pull that off. This whole movie is like you saying it's insane that they were able to pull that off with almost every aspect of it that you see. And that was definitely one of those as well. So another thing you got to go into when you talk about this movie is how relentlessly romantic it is. Once again, you kind of, when you see it from this Beauty and the Beast angle, you kind of see it as, it just seems so unlikely a person like him would fall for a creation like Edward. But their performances are really able to gradually make that happen, and the storytelling is a big thing in that as well. And there are those moments where it's very by-the-book romance. There's the asshole boyfriend that's in the way, with Anthony Michael Hall usually being on the other side of that. And then you have moments where he can just totally embarrass himself, like the moment when they first meet, when the continuing on of that first night they meet when Arkin gets him drunk on one drink, or the moment when he cuts the meat and accidentally drops it in her lap. That moment where even if you are an inhuman creation, you're half human anyway, you're still going to make a fool out of yourself in front of the person that you care about and hope to make an impression on. And you're going to have those humiliating moments that ultimately end up leading to where they lead. Um, and how she will eventually... And it's actually believable when she starts to kind of see... Because obviously, at first she's terrified of him, but then she kind of sees the sensitive side of him. And where she kind of sticks up for him a little bit, the more human he starts to come off as. But then, obviously, by the end of this, we've gotten to the point to where it's full on, and then we get some of the most romantic scenes in movie history. And most of the time, they're completely tragic. Obviously, probably the most famous line in the movie is when everything is coming to a head, and Edward is the outcast of society, and now Kim, oddly enough, is the only one that's really realizes him for who he is and realizes why this is spun out of control and knows that Edward is not the one to blame for all this. And the scene where she says, "Hold me," and he just raises his hands and says that I can't. And then there is a big payoff to that right after where she makes it work. and that's basically the whole kind of thing of this relationship is obviously it can't be, but they're going to do what they can with it. Whether it be her dancing in the ice that he makes. There is the moment, I believe the real turning point here, when it's the ultimate romantic line. It's the line where Kim has this big epiphany about what's going on and just everything. And it's honestly believable up to this point that this would be her turning point, which is, of course, the moment when he confesses that he played dumb even though he knew they were breaking into Jim's house, and when she asks why he would do such a thing, why would he do that knowing he'd probably get in trouble, and just very straightforward with nothing other than love and admiration in his voice, no bitterness, no nothing, just a very straightforward, because you asked me to. And it's very believable in that moment. This is when Kim realizes what Edward's feelings are and why he does the things that he does and reacts to things in the way that he does, which makes the direction this goes all the more believable it is, the more romantic it is, and the fact that you can make that stuff believable in this story is the real accomplishment. And yes, this did. Obviously, this did get, sadly, only one Oscar nomination, which was its makeup, I think. There could be... It feels like production design should be in there, but I know... I believe makeup was the only one, and obviously, you look at Edward and that's one thing. Also, the old Winona makeup could have been, like, really cheesy or just looked really bad, but it looks really good, too. I'm not sure. I think the point is supposed to be we don't realize it's her until the end, because it seems like when she takes her glasses off at the end, it's supposed to be kind of this big reveal that it's her. But, so yeah, I thought that whole kind of bookend here is really well done also. And then, of course, this movie ends up taking the dark turn, where I think, obviously, it's the whole him getting arrested and when Jim really goes off is kind of the turning point. I've always kind of seen it as, Kathy Baker's failed seduction seems to be when this movie really starts to take its dark turn. Despite the fact we do have that comedic follow-up when he just casually says, "She took me in the back room and took her clothes off." And everybody reacts to this except for Arkin, who seems to not hear this. But then, obviously, it kind of gets darker and darker from that point on. When... Obviously, all this has gone down, and then even though it's to tell him to fuck off, seeing Kim run to Jim kind of sets something off in Edward, and this is kind of the weird thing where I'm sure it's obvious to most people, and it's kind of this, blatant commentary on human nature. But the way Edward is seen as an outcast, and how he's not even completely human, and the way he interacts with all these other humans, even though he seems to be much more of a pure-hearted character than everybody else around him, with the exception of the Boggs, really. But then, the more he starts to have these human emotions come out, the more monstrous he seems to become, ironically. This moment when he starts to feel, once you feel love, then you start to feel jealousy. And when he sees Jim, it just kind of goes off in him, this anger, and he goes into this animalistic tirade of when he scrapes the walls, and this moment, this very eerie moment, when we're watching him look at himself in the mirror and he's clawing into the walls, and it's just weird watching how the more human he becomes, the more it's like he's reverting back to a monstrosity. And it's this really interesting, like I said, it could be like this totally blatant commentary on human nature or whatever, where it's the more human you are, the more inhuman you actually are, or whatever. There's stuff like that, but obviously it does circle back around. I do like also that Christmas tends to be this joyous time of year, and in this particular movie, Christmas is this, like when you see the Christmas lights and all that, you start to realize, if you've seen the movie many times, you know Christmas is when the shit goes down. Christmas is when it gets really dark, and I thought that was kind of an interesting turn on this usually joyous holiday, and its portrayal. But yeah, then obviously, as the movie goes on, he does get, like, he's reverting back to that, and before he gets rid of them completely, his clothes start to have tears in them that he doesn't even bother to fix anymore. So that in itself is kind of this visual aid to show us that we're getting closer to that point of where he's going to be right back to where he was. But the thing is we don't get there until, once we've gotten past that, the romance of it does come back, and even though it does have that tragic ending where they have to part ways, I totally understand if people question the climax. I feel the same way about Beauty and the Beast, when it probably does seem a little bit out of nowhere, where obviously Jim is shown throughout the movie he can be a bit aggressive. But for the most part, it's played up as this jock type, and it really only gets bad if, like I said, he's under the influence of alcohol. But then, him just kind of showing up in this drunken rage, and he owns a gun now, and he actually shows up to kill Edward, and we have this whole big climax that's almost action-like. I can understand if people think that totally stands out in a weird way. But I do think the progression is enough to get us there, and it does give us a big climax that does take us in the direction we need to go, which is Kim needs to convince them that Edward is dead so that he can be safe back where he came from. Safe from this Frankenstein-like mob that has chased him back here. So that's where I think the movie really succeeds, that it's able to come back and be this completely romantic movie, which succeeds in that because it takes this inhuman character and makes him something that's more human than most of the characters in the movie. And just makes it this really endearing quality, and it's not just his freaky-ass appearance and his ordeal that makes him a really famous, recognizable character. I do think that if you can, track down that video on YouTube where that dude on the news was basically just trolling people when they were talking about Edward Snowden. But while he's describing Edward Snowden, he's actually describing Edward Scissorhands, and the news anchors don't seem to catch on for a long time. So yes, it's a movie that's really, really held its place, and I do think it's the Tim Burton masterpiece for me. I don't think it's even close. Not to mention just falling into the category of one of my favorite movies ever. Like, I somewhat have a top 5, but I never want to solidify just because I see so many things and have seen so many things from so many different times and places. But if I had to make a top 5, I've always said this would probably be in it. So, with that said, there's still Beauty and the Beast, one of Disney's more beloved animated movies. Beloved to the extent, before I go into anything, I should probably mention that since we discussed the Oscars a lot in these videos, it's worth noting that Beauty and the Beast has a very specific Oscar history, which is obviously there have been 3 movies nominated for Best Picture that were animated, with this, Up, and Toy Story 3. But the thing that you'll notice is that obviously, from 2009 forward, we've had the expanded field, where Best Picture nominees can be anywhere from 10. And so with that, obviously, without that, Toy Story 3 and Up would not have been nominated for Best Picture. Like, there's really no question. They're Best Picture nominees because of the expanded field. Beauty and the Beast was the very first animated movie to be nominated for Best Picture, and that was in 1991 when there were only 5 nominees, a very solidified only 5. With movies like Thelma and Louise missing out, and competition like Silence of the Lambs and JFK. And you realize that this might as well be it's a huge accomplishment that this movie did that, and it has yet to be topped because any animated movie has not reached the top 5 status of the Oscars since then. And it really, and it's even, like I said, it's even it's probably a half strong year. This is also the year Jack Palance won for City Slickers, so there's about half and half, but there are certainly movies that could have easily bumped this out, but it held its ground and remained that beloved throughout the year that the Academy took to it and made it a top 5 movie, which has not happened to an animated movie, had not happened to an animated movie before, and it hasn't happened since. So when you go in with that way of thinking, it's another one of those movies that is told in a very fairy tale fashion, like most Disney movies, but this one even more so, I think. Not just the way we start off with that opening where the story is told to us and we get to this point, but just the whole thing of it feels like this is a movie that doesn't take for granted the fact that it's animated. And honestly, actually, the thing I want to start going into that with is, obviously, one of the most important things here is the character of Belle, and the thing about Belle's character is, for starters, Paige O'Hara's voice work obviously really brings her to life in a great way, but also just the animation in general, because when you look at it, she's really one of the first Disney princesses, which, when you go all the way back to the 30s, to 1991, there's a lot to go through. But I remember feeling like she was one of the first ones that actually felt like a real person. Because when you look at it, because there's ones that aren't even technically human, like Ariel. But then when you go back and you look at like Snow White and Cinderella. With Cinderella, it's like, Cinderella's so boring, the movie didn't even want to focus on her. It's like, Cinderella is like 10% of that movie. And she's just kind of this very bland animation of a blonde princess. And then you go back and you look at Snow White, even though Snow White is probably my favorite of the classic Disney animated movies. When you look at Snow White, she's very, very vaguely animated. Like, she barely has a face. It's all about what happens around her. But with Belle was actually kind of given this... she felt much more kind of lived in than all the other princesses. She actually felt like a real character, like somebody that characters could actually interact with, that wouldn't just feel like this otherworldly princess type. And we get this immediately in her little opening number, and she does have those moments where she's like, is there more to this and all that, but for the most part, she's down to earth enough that the whole point of her is this, once again, bringing believability to a fairy tale. Seems futile, but it really kind of adds this whole other thing to the story and really, really drives it to where you kind of wonder what we do with her meeting the Beast, and how, much like Edward Scissorhands, are we going to get to that point to where they fall in love with each other and one falls in love with the other. But we do kind of see, the thing about it though is that the interesting thing about Beauty and the Beast is there's this whole thing that's been going around where people on the internet think they're super clever by bringing up the story of Beauty and the Beast is just Stockholm Syndrome. And they just leave it at that, where it's like, he kept her captive and then she fell in love, that's Stockholm Syndrome. But the thing is when you actually watch the goddamn movie, it plays up in a very different way, and that is, when Belle shows up to the castle, obviously it's been a long time since the Beast has seen a woman. So, and obviously the whole thing is, once he falls in love, this curse will break. So he's got to actually fall in love and not just force it. But the thing here is that when she shows up, they're obviously going to be opposites. She's going to be her, who we talked about, and he is the Beast, who hates everything, and he's just angry all the time, and roaring and all that. And, like, it just the slightest little thing sets him off. So, but then we see that change to where it's like, when she decides, you know, don't take my dad hostage, take me hostage, and he immediately kind of sees that sacrifice in her, and it kind of changes his look upon her. But then you go forward, so we kind of see what he sees in her immediately, which is this sacrifice that she made. So you go forward, and she doesn't like him. She doesn't like being here. She doesn't like him. She doesn't like his shitty attitude. So she's going to hate this until she can finally get out. And when she finally does get out, she's free. She's gone. She could have gone all the way. The only thing that stopped her from just getting right back was the wolves. And that's the thing is, now that she is free, she is no longer locked up in this castle, the wolves happen, and he saves her. And from this point on, everything is her decision. This isn't a, he locked her up and manipulated her into loving him thing. If you watch, you will notice the turning point here is the fact that he saves her life. He could have just screamed, go, you know, go whatever do what you're gonna do, I don't care anymore. I'm just pissed off, and I'm gonna continue to be pissed off and trapped here as this beast or whatever. But he went out, and he saved her life with the wolves. And it was her that took him back to treat his wounds. And it's at this point to when she actually sees an arc in him. He doesn't really have this arc to witness the way that she does. She gets to see, oh, I don't think, starting from him saving her life to playing with the birds and all that other shit, that whole number, it's like she sees and comes to this realization, not, oh, I think he's bad, oh, I love him now. There's this transition of, this isn't who I thought it was. Like, there is, obviously, the beast qualities in him, but that's the surface. This isn't the person I thought it was. There's clearly a real human being in there that's kind of hoping to come out and is only really angry because he's been a beast for God knows how long. With nobody else around him, except for talking inanimate objects. So, really, the question is kind of like, it's less, oh my god, how did this is the weird thing that it does, is you see Belle and you see Beast, and you think, oh my god, how does she come to love a beast? But when you look at it from this perspective, it's more like, how did he come to love her? Because it's like, we see her see him and his transition. With her, it's kind of like, but then obviously there are those moments where it's like, you look at real life and it's kind of like, there are those people that probably, especially like Beast, that have all those horrible qualities about themselves, and like the whole, you know, narcissistic reason that he was turned into a beast to begin with. Those moments where the reason he falls for Belle is because he sees in her what's not in him, or what wasn't in him. There's really good qualities, and how there's kind of that opposite effect where what he hates about himself is what he loves about her, and then there is a gradual love story that forms here. So I never bought the whole Stockholm thing. I still think it's people on the internet just really trying as hard as they can to be clever, but when you actually watch the movie, it doesn't really work out like that. And then I do say, I talk about the transitions, I do think still the movie is a bit too short. There is an extended version that's about 6 minutes longer. But for the most part, it does feel like the characterization might be a little too fast. They work that transition in there, which is what's important. But I still feel like, I don't know if it's because I've seen it a number of times too, but it just feels like it moves very fast, almost to a fault. I don't know if that's because of, you know, seeing Cocteau's movie and Condon's movie, if it's like seeing these expanded versions of it makes this feel really chopped down when you see other movies that kind of drag it out a little bit. To where, like when he says that he cares about her, you know, or loves her more than anything, to say more than anything feels pretty sudden in the movie when it happens. But like I said, when you look at it, the whole thing, there is that transition there. Even if it does feel a bit sped up to kind of get to more of a kid-friendly 84-minute runtime. But even so, then you go in and you look at the other characters, like obviously Gaston is a big character in this, and there is Richard White does his voice brilliantly, and this character is very interesting in the fact that he has to be. He's the villain, but he's also very comedic. He's got a very Billy Zane like quality to him. But then ultimately, much like Jim, has to have this drastic turning point to where, oh, by the way, he's a psychopath now. Just right at the end here. But up till we get to that point, I do like that there seems to be little clues given. I like the way they use the fact that even though Gaston is this really, really big personality, like he's really brightly animated and all of his songs are like really flamboyant and he's just this really big personality, the first time when we see him, he's in the shadows. Like he's kind of like hidden in the darkness a little bit. And then throughout these scenes, when he's in pure daylight, it'll be like there's a shadow cast on half of his face. And it's almost kind of like a foreshadowing throughout the movie, regardless of how big and boisterous his character is. There's that kind of darkness we keep getting hinted at through the animation. So I thought that was a really good kind of use of foreshadowing. And also, I do think that use of shadows there is probably better than the Beast reveal, because you look at like the French movie and you see the way like when she's just sitting at the table and then the Beast like comes up behind her and it's this really big, like she reacts to him before she even sees him, and it's this really, really big moment in that movie, and it just kind of had that whole dreamlike quality to it. And in this, it's like there's really no hiding the Beast. Like he's in the shadows, but we so very clearly see him. So it's not the big moment it built itself up to be when he steps into the light. I feel like that he could have been handled with a bit more mystery before we got a really, really good look at him. So yeah, that's kind of one fault I kind of have that the movie has. But talking about this animation though, not just having those nice little details like the way Gaston's face is lit, but some of the settings as well, where it's like I talked about before, the library is just so incredibly massive, and one of those things that you can imagine only existing in animation. Like I said, they did not take that for granted, because you look, like I said, like the French movie feels really, really, dreamlike, and really like this whole other thing that has so many layers in it. And then you have Bill Condon's movie, and while live action can certainly bring certain things to life, there are some things that have to exist solely in animation, and this movie really pulls that off. The ballroom too, like these are things to where once you see them in this movie, a live action movie can't really do them justice anymore. So I thought that's really what made it strong. And also another thing that really is a strength to this movie, that where a lot of movies would fail, are the songs. Like there are those moments where when you hear that a movie's going to be a musical, if you're not too into musicals, that might be a moment where you think, oh, I'm not totally sure, because there are moments where not all the songs are going to be good, and you have that worry. But the thing is there are just enough songs in this movie. There aren't too many. There's not one that doesn't belong, and they're all memorable. And they're all good. There's the one I would say is the one when they're prepping to storm the Beast's castle. At the very end. As important as it is, it's totally important. It's like the whole setup for the climax, but it's like that's the one song where I hear it and I'm like, oh yeah, that's in this too, I forgot. But apart from that, all the other songs are just so incredibly memorable and actually serve to tell the story. There is not one filler song, and not one of those songs where you're like, oh, well, like Cheer Up Charlie and Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, where it's like there's always that one song that you're like, they could cut this. Like, I really don't care about this song, it doesn't need to be here. All the songs in this movie actually have their purpose, and they all have kind of a different vibe to them as well. Like, there's funny songs like, Gaston's song, then there's Be Our Guest, which is like this big, like, Busby Berkeley thing, or like out of a Fred Astaire movie or something, just these really, really big numbers, like something that would be in the Bandwagon or something, or Singing in the Rain. And then you have Beauty and the Beast, which is just where the romanticism is really brought into it. It's like every song in the movie has a different vibe. There's the one, like I said, where they're playing with the birds and shit, and it's like the Beast transition where she realizes the big moment where she realizes he's not the beast that the surface would tell you that he is. They all have their purpose, and they're all just work. And for a musical, that's like really, really rare. So, and I really love that they didn't try to overdo it with the songs and add more than they needed to. Every song is there because it should be and serves what it's doing. Um, so, yeah, and then obviously this was just a really... Well, yeah, obviously, and then like I said, we do get to the end where it probably feels like it might take a drastic transition when Gaston goes completely crazy, and the climax of this movie is basically the climax of The Crow, and this came first. I don't know what that tells you. And there's the moment when it gets really dark, like when Gaston's about to fall, as he's falling to his death, like when he falls towards the camera, there are like those two frames when you can see skulls in his eyes, and it's like, that's a really freaky detail they threw in there. But then once again, we get past the darkness and ultimately land on our romantic ending. In this case, unlike Edward Scissorhands, it's happy as opposed to tragic, which works just as well because it works well with the context. With both their endings can go in different directions. There's a time and a place for tragic, there's a time and a place for happy, and both these movies know when those times are and use them to their advantage. And obviously this was the point where Disney was kind of really reaching that Renaissance period, and it was really, you could throw, The Little Mermaid was like 2 years before this, but also Beauty and the Beast seemed to really capture, especially with that acclaim you can tell it got, to where it was kind of a reboot of the idea. Obviously, way back in the day this was the case, but this was kind of the reboot of the idea that animation wasn't strictly for children, that it could be for everybody, and you could make a very, serious romantic movie, but also make it totally and completely child-friendly. All the way up to the talking, objects, like Jerry Orbach's voice is practically unrecognizable as Lemire, and then David Ogden Stiers as Cogsworth, which is like the perfect partnership. And then the ending climax where it gets really silly and everybody's fighting. LeFou is also a character that definitely fits with the more childlike vibe. But it was able to combine and just really make, more or less, despite these silly aspects and despite the fact that it could be a movie for children as well, it had this very mature aspect to its storytelling and really went back to those olden days of, like, turning fairy tales into these visual, feasts. And it really, really accomplished something, like I said, especially that Oscar accomplishment was a really big deal, and still to this day is a big deal. But having said that, obviously, as I said, Edward Scissorhands is one of my favorite movies ever. Beauty and the Beast is not one of my favorite Disney animated movies, but I totally and completely respect it for what it is. I could still watch it 100 times over. Not as many times as The Lion King or Snow White, but it is definitely up there with I would say it's for sure up there with the best, but I think it's still pretty far away from the heights of something like Snow White or The Lion King. But, so yes, that's what we have here. Now, next week, I will probably do that Western one, which, like I said, is a movie that people really, really fawn over, but there's one I might like more than it that can very easily be compared to it. And for reviews this week, I'm going to see Valerian, as well as The Nut Job. I know. Along with Going in Style and a new Richard Gere or Newberman movie. It'll be the following week that I see Annabelle. So Annabelle will be reviewed with Logan Lucky the following week. So if you're looking forward to that or whatever. So yeah, that's what we have going on.